This is Sarah and Dawn from AAI. We are going to just take a minute or two. We are live here on Instagram and on Facebook. We're going to just give folks a couple minutes to log on. We are here in the snowy Tetons. We're watching the snow come down right now, which is kind of crazy. We had spring yesterday and the day before, but now it's back to snow. Since it's still snowing out there, if you are traveling in the backcountry, we definitely ask that everyone think as a community member. And really, if you are traveling in the backcountry, think about the impacts that you could have on your community if you get hurt, if you get avalanched, anything like that. So choose to travel conservatively if you are traveling out in the backcountry. Yeah, right now it's snowing here, so avalanche hazard is rising. So think about that as well. And today we thought we'd do things a little bit differently. I've mainly been doing these Instagram lives, but I roped my husband and co-owner Don Carpenter into talking today. And we want to talk about checklists and using checklists to plan a backcountry travel day as well as execute it. And Don was instrumental in terms of building the AAI checklist and refining it. And so Dawn, I'm going to turn a lot of this over to you. We're going to do a little interview style, and talk to me about what inspired building the AAI checklist.
Well, here is a copy of the AAI checklist, and it was inspired, based on the fact that traveling in avalanche terrain. In the backcountry, it's a complex environment, a lot of moving parts, and it's sort of similar. It has a lot of similarities to a medical environment where it's this complex environment. It's also high risk with high consequences, and it's easy to skip a step. Our checklist, there's nothing earth-shattering in this checklist, but most backcountry travelers are going to do most of the things on this checklist most of the time. But there's very few that are going to do all the things on this checklist all the time. So that's really one of the primary goals is in our complex environment with high risk and high consequences. The checklist is a tool to make better decisions, increase communication, and hopefully avoid skipping a step.
And talk to me about characteristics of a good checklist. I know, a lot of industries are adopting checklists, and I think they could probably translate more and more into the outdoor industry. What should we think about in terms of a good checklist?
Well, my learning and research on building a checklist started with the checklist Manifesto, which talks about using checklists in a medical setting. And there's no check. What I learned there is it's impossible to make a checklist that's perfect from the get-go. So one of the aspects of a checklist is you need to build a checklist and then test it in the real world, see how it works, and most likely refine it. The other part about a checklist is it needs to be simple so that it's usable. Our checklist started out as a full page, 8.5 by 11. It really just wasn't usable. So it needs to be simple. By simplifying it, we need to focus on really the important things that could get you in trouble, that could injure or kill you. And it needs to have specific points in time and space when you use that checklist, when you're cued to pull that checklist out and refer to it.
Okay. All right. And one of the things that we were talking about with the checklist is it just helps every step of the way, basically trying to prevent a big problem. You have this document about here that you were going to talk about.
This is what we call it's a Swiss cheese model, and it could apply to a whole bunch of different risky environments. And over here we've got a bad outcome. In the snow and avalanche world, that would be being involved, injured, or even killed in an avalanche. And the Swiss cheese model kind of shows that there are a whole bunch of different layers in your system or in your line of defense to prevent yourself from getting to that bad outcome. And you may screw up in one or two of these places, but hopefully part of this system catches you before that bad outcome. And the checklist is helping us or encouraging us to really focus on some of these layers of the system and try and avoid getting to the bad outcome.
Great. Talk me through the AAI checklist then.
Yeah. So and again, this was a process, and it's an ongoing process. We could continue to refine and change this, but we broke our checklist into 3 parts and tried to keep it simple, keep it focused on things that could really get you in trouble, and have the individual components of the checklist kind of act as specific pause points. So the first part of the checklist we call it the pre-trip plan. And so this whole front page of the checklist is a discussion that would happen with you and your partners before you even head out into the backcountry. So you're discussing current conditions, you are identifying avalanche problems, you are talking about what kind of terrain would be appropriate for that given day, and then some final planning. So that's all that part of the checklist happens before you head into the field. The last part of the checklist is we call it post-trip discussion. It's a debrief, and we do that when we get out of the field. Those 2 parts of the checklist have obvious points in time when you pull that checklist out: before you go into the field to plan your day, and when you get out of the field to debrief your day. The component of the checklist that happens in the field is a little bit more complicated. You need to have you basically need to have situational awareness and identify avalanche terrain and make some conscious decisions before you expose your party to that avalanche terrain.
Great. Yeah. So, and as we're going, we're talking about checklists and decision making. Feel free to write in any questions. We're happy to answer them. Really, the concept behind the AAI checklist was, like Don said, to have a structured discussion and a way to plan effective tours and also communicate with partners. And I know for me, I have decided to just use this with anyone that I tour in the backcountry with as a way to communicate, because I've found that sometimes the trickiest piece is actually just being able to communicate with your partner and frame the discussion. So, really in the conversation when you're out in the field, there's just 5 or 6 simple questions of, is our terrain consistent with our plan that we made before we walked out in the field? Any signs of instability? What's the likelihood and consequence of triggering an avalanche? And is this a go or no go decision? And then making plans. So I do think, like we were talking about earlier, like if you handed us a flight checklist, neither of us would do very well with this. So this is not without you need some training in order to effectively use this. But this is a great way to guide discussion. And someone just asked how the checklist has evolved since its inception and what research we've used. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, well, the biggest way the checklist has evolved is that we've shrunk it down. If it's got too many steps, it's just unusable. Nobody's going to carry a full notebook in the field. So we've simplified it onto this little sheet that you could fit into a small pocket in your jacket. We were fortunate enough to have, I was able to have some communication with Dan Borman, who is famous checklist developer for the Boeing Corporation, and he helped me take our large format checklist and really streamline it down. He helped me identify certain pause points and those distinct places in time and space where you would use the checklist. And as I mentioned, the pre-trip plan, that's obvious. That happens at your house, in the car, but before you go into the backcountry. The post-trip discussion, that's back at the trailhead at the end of the day, at the bar, at home. Those are easy. The stuff that goes on in the field is a little bit more challenging. Dan Borman used an example of a fire department that had developed a checklist, and he helped them streamline their checklist. Much of what they had in the original checklist were just things that were involved with actually driving the fire truck. So we can't put everything in a checklist that you're going to do in the backcountry. We can't put every single thing that you're going to do in the backcountry in the checklist, but we tried to keep it focused on specific things that might really injure or kill you.
Yeah, and this sort of dovetails into, are there ways that this checklist is adapted throughout the industry? And this is another way I would say that it continues to be evolving and getting streamlined.
This checklist that we keep referring to is more of a backcountry checklist for a recreational backcountry user. We have created a similar format for a mitigator for somebody in a ski patrol setting, and many of the things are the same, but it's in a slightly different application. And then on our professional avalanche courses, the pre and post trip planning and discussion are much more in depth. So they've been adapted for that professional setting with a more in depth pre trip and post trip planning.
Yeah, and those documents really are, morning and evening forms for folks in the professional industry, serve as professional documentation, all of that. Yeah. There was a comment about this also being shared with climbers, and yes, this checklist is a backcountry travel specific checklist. It is not a skier specific checklist. Obviously, if you're climbing in the world of, in snowy mountains, you also need to evaluate avalanche hazard and have a plan. The interesting thing with climbing is you're often evaluating from the bottom up versus the top down, so you can be more exposed at times. But the process of deciding whether your climbing objective is appropriate, what hazards are out there, how to communicate with your partners, they're exactly the same. So continuing to use this. And there was also a question about if this checklist varies based on the skier ability. And really, this is the framework for whether you're a beginner backcountry traveler or an advanced one, right?
Yeah, this is our I'd call it our basic recreational backcountry checklist that would be for a skier, a snow machiner, a snowboarder, or a climber. We have this pre-trip plan is a fair bit more in depth when we go into the professional realm, and we're working in that same terrain day in and day out.
Great. And any other considerations when you're thinking about checklists or communication in the backcountry or planning and executing?
That is, I think you hit the nail on the head with communication. As I said earlier, there's no checklist that's going to be perfect from the get-go. It's you're going to have to refine it. It's the goal with a checklist is really a system for communication, and that hopefully drives better decision making and safer travel in the mountains. Whatever system or checklist you may use, you're going to want to use it, test it, refine it. And I think one of the biggest challenges is actually having partners that are open to the idea. That's a big part of it as well. It's just having partners that you feel comfortable communicating, you feel comfortable voicing a concern. That's really the most important thing. And then this checklist is a framework to help you voice those observations, voice those concerns, and again, make better decisions in the long run.
Great. Are we missing anything else
I think
in terms of
that
communication?
I think that's about it.
Okay. It's so fun seeing all the folks that are on Instagram Live and Facebook Live. We've got someone that we climbed Denali with. We've got friends that are showing up. We really appreciate everyone showing up here. If you're interested in knowing more about our checklist, if you're interested in using it, if you have feedback to offer, we would love it. Shoot us a note on Facebook, on Instagram, on the AAI email address. And again, if there are other topics that you want us to cover, we're going to keep trying to do these Instagram and Facebook Lives. They might end up being once a week rather than twice a week, but shoot us notes on what you want us to cover. And thanks a ton for attending. And if you are traveling in the backcountry, again, we really urge you to think as a community member and keep in mind we are still, there's a lot of stay-at-home orders still. So if you are traveling out there, think about the impact of getting hurt or getting avalanched on your community as well. So thanks, everyone, and we hope to see you again. Anything else to add? All right. Thanks for letting me interview you.
You bet.
All right. Bye.